Good morning. I know it's an exciting time for you. Tomorrow you go out on break. You get your much needed sleep. You're going to be, some of you be traveling, some going with athletic teams to the southern climes, and it's well deserved, I know. And also seniors, your last official morning meeting. You guys really love morning meeting, don't you? Of course you do. So this is important. This is an important time together. It really is. So this will be your last. But you'll see your peers will be speaking. So in April and May. So you'll come back and you'll visit us, right? So I know it's an important time, and you got your last papers and things to get in. But this is I'm really excited about today because our guest speaker, Mr. Norman Solomon, is somebody I've been inspired by for many years. He doesn't know that, but he does now because he's here. I've read a lot of his columns over the years. I've seen him on CNN, MSNBC, what used to be the McNeil-Lehrer Report, and recently on Democracy Now! And many other places. So I want to introduce him, but I want to say I sent you a link last night that Mr. Solomon sent to me. Beyond Vietnam, Time to Break Silence. Did anybody get a chance to read that? Some of you did. Some of you at least opened it. I know some of you opened it. But anyhow, wanted you, and at least a few of you read that, because that'll be something we'll refer to. But also, I want to remind you that right after this, F Block will be in the Taft living room for a Q&A. Some classes are already coming, but if you have free time, you want to come, students, faculty, staff can come in and join us. And then in C and D blocks in the Taft living room, where I have my classes, some other classes will also join us, but you can come in with lunch and join us there as well, C and D blocks. So right through F, D, and C, or F, C, and D, or three in a row. But you know what's really important, and I asked Mr. Solomon, said that, what you want me to tell him something about the school, and I said, we're a school that's committed to service. Our model is to serve and not serve. And I think about what our founder, Horace Taft, said, that the great thing about a boarding school is it helps to draw us out of ourselves, out of our limited view of things. We get constricted sometimes. And to be in service to one another as students and as teachers. And he was very impressed by that. But let me share a few things about him. Author of a dozen books on media, political discourse, and public policy, including War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death, has been adopted as required reading in many colleges. He's a co-founder of the national online civic action organization, rootsaction.org. You can check that out, rootsaction.org, which now has more than 200,000 active members nationwide. He's a former co-chair of the Healthcare Not Warfare National Campaign. Organized and went on 3 missions to Baghdad prior to the invasion of Iraq, including one led by Congressman Nick Rahal and former U.S. Senator James Borzik, seeking alternatives to war. He was one of the lone voices on national television against Iraq before the start of the war in 2003, appearing on CNN and other major TV networks more than a dozen times to argue for diplomacy instead of U.S. attack. He organized and went on fact-finding trips to Afghanistan in 2009. The New York Times Magazine has called him a leading progressive activist. The Los Angeles Times has called him a formidable thinker and activist. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including the George Orwell Award for distinguished contribution to honesty and clarity in public language, and the annual Ruben Salazar Journalism Award. And those of you who are taking Mr. Hinker's class, Dystopia, of reading about Orwell, right? If some of you are here, you'll be joining us later today. He's also the founder and the 13-year executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, overseeing research and liaison with thousands of experts on a wide range of public policy issues. There's so much more to his resume and his accomplishments, but too numerous to mention here, but join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Norman Solomon.
Thank you. Hey, I really appreciate the chance to speak with you here this morning at the Taft School. And, I was hearing about, among many other activities, the baseball team is so hot it's going to Florida. And I'd actually like to join you as a longtime baseball fan, but it made me think about baseball. And of course, we're on the edge of that season coming up. And, one of our recent presidents was described this way. He was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately because each of us, have no control over where we were born. And that comment, unfortunately, is all too insightful for how a lot of us feel. And frankly, I've realized I felt that way sometimes. Born on third base, hey, I hit a triple. And it goes with that idea, and we've probably heard this sometimes, each of us in different forms, this idea, hey, I did it myself. I have this huge house. I have these wonderful cars. I have this great motorboat or whatever. I have all this wealth. I did it all myself. Well, for starters, for real starters, the theologian Cornel West has said, oh, I see. You were born all by yourself, huh? You did it all by yourself. You built all those roads that you travel over every day. You built the schools. You taught yourself. Nobody helped you. Your mom and dad didn't really help you at all. I mean, this is sort of a mythology that we're brought up with that is absolutely counter to the idea that I think is embodied in the concept to go ahead and serve and not be served. It's an antithetical, it's a juxtaposition, yet in the real world, sometimes the two attitudes cross, That if we are here, not just to be served, but to help others, to be of service, then that's totally contrary to this idea we did it all ourselves. We're here to be served because we're just so great as individuals and as even communities. So I think we always, of whatever age we are, 10, 20, 50, 80, we've got this concept, this challenge of what does it mean? And I know this is a centerpiece of this school. What does it mean to aspire to be a whole person? The head, the heart, the desires, the contemplation, the spiritual connection, all the different words we use which are imprecise, but what does it mean? As the saying goes, why are we here? A deceptively simple question, and as time goes on, such a central question to who we are. We have definitions. I mean, when I was growing up, humanity was sort of tacitly communicated as being, white guys, and, women could kind of show up once in a while. And we've grown through people struggling and thinking and challenging each other. No, as the great writer Gore Vidal said, humanity doesn't have a race. Humanity doesn't have a gender or a sexual orientation or an economic standing. Humanity doesn't have those different breakup sections. Humanity is a whole around the planet, and yet we have that challenge because it's easy for someone to come up here and say that, but what does that mean day to day? How do we get closer to that ideal in practice? I think quite often of those who've been so influential in our lives, in our country and beyond, and one of the names, one of the lives that looms so large in our country is Martin Luther King Jr. And I know at this point, he's on a postage stamp, and we have a holiday every year, and we see footage on TV of I Have a Dream speech and so forth. And it's easy after a while to feel like, oh yeah, that guy, I've been there, done that. I've learned about him. And when we get on with learning about other people and other aspects of our history and heritage, and yet what I keep re-realizing, is that that's sort of like saying if you were caring about music oh, Beethoven, I've heard Beethoven. I don't need to hear Beethoven anymore. I heard Fifth Symphony once or twice. I don't need to hear any Beethoven anymore. I got it. Get it? Got it. If you were a jazz fan, John Coltrane. Oh, I heard John Coltrane a couple times. Why would I want to listen to Coltrane again? The fact is that jazz musicians 30, 40 years after Coltrane's death still have tried to grasp some of the depth of his cutting-edge work, who he was, what his spirit and technical capacities were that he shared with people. And in that way, and in many other profound aspects, I think that's true of the life and work, the words, the works of Martin Luther King Jr. Here we are in 2013, and we still have this challenge to get deeper, to get more real. You know, we have that expression now, real time. We live in real time. And then you break that apart. What do we mean by real time? It means we're in this moment in time, as King talked about the fierce urgency of now, and we're talking about real. We're talking about, oh, I'd rather be more real than less real. I'd rather be more genuine so that I can live more fully, more meaningfully, which I think does include to serve, not just to be served, not to be served, but to find broader and deeper meaning. And so when I think about Dr. King, there is the media that's repeated again and again, the I have a dream speech, but you wouldn't know it from the media, but he didn't die in 1963 after he gave an I have a dream speech. He lived on for several more years where he, like we all aspire to, he continued to grow the depth and breadth of his vision. And in that process, he said that we have a structural challenge in our society, in our country, in our world. He put it this way: true compassion is not about flinging a coin to a beggar. It's about changing a system that creates beggars. That's a way that King went deeper. And when he talked about what he called guided missiles and misguided men, he was speaking in 1967, but he could be with us speaking in 2013. Guided missiles and misguided men. Those who sit in the air-conditioned offices of power in Washington. Those who order others to sit in the air-conditioned offices in Nevada behind the computer screens. Directing the pixels on their computer screens, where far away across the planet a drone missile fires what's called Hellfire, named by the Pentagon, a Hellfire missile. Visits death and destruction on people, not only those designated as militants, but documented to be hundreds of young people, children and others, no more or less deserving than you or me, very similar to us. They had no less or more control over what base they were born on than you or me. And so when Dr. King talked about what he called in 1967 the madness of militarism, his words are with us today. The authority has always been very hard to challenge because, as was the case when I was a teenager, you had a president who did some good things, who talked in humanistic terms and gave the orders that sent the missiles that killed the children, all in the name, we're told, of freedom and democracy. And that is the world that we live in today. That is a country we live in today. That is a society that has fallen and been stricken by what Dr. King called the madness of militarism. And when I went to Baghdad 3 times in 2002 and early 2003, and I walked through streets and I saw people of all ages, and I thought, will my country bomb you? And the answer, of course, we know. It's historical reality, and some of those people I saw are no longer alive, not through natural causes, but because of the war that ensued and the results of what we did in our country and what we were unable to do. And so when you look ahead and you see the future, it's so important for you to consider who we are, who we want to be. Who do we want to be? In 2009, when I went to Kabul, right on the edge of that capital city of Afghanistan, I went to refugee camp number 5 from the Helmand province. And I met a little girl named Guljuma. She was 7 years old at the time. She had been woken up one morning, as her father explained to me, with the ground shaking in their little house in Helmand province. And then the walls fell in, and their mom was killed. And when I saw Guljuma, she was living in a refugee camp. And she was struggling with the fact that she has now just one arm. She has just one arm because of the bombs that fell that I helped pay for, and your parents, if they are U.S. citizens, helped pay for. The bombs that fell in her neighborhood. And so I was faced with the challenge of, what do you say to a 7-year-old girl who now has one arm? And she would sit and try to sort of, because we were taking pictures sort of like where she didn't have an arm, she would sort of lean that shoulder away so that the picture would show her arm that she still had. And I thought, well, what do you say? What do you say to someone who has suffered that experience and continues to live with it? And my country, where we're living with the consent of the governed, that's what they teach us in the civics classes, we did that to you. Well, we talk about real time, and we talk about how we want to be living a life of meaning. And there are no easy answers, because conformity is very powerful. That's true of every society, it's true of every ideology, that we have a tremendous amount of incentive, whether we're conscious of it or not, to conform, to not rock the big boat, to not challenge too much, to go along to get along, to rise through the hierarchy. And it's sort of a paradox, because the social movements, and I know you've been studying about various aspects of history of this country involving social movements, it's sort of a collective activity. People do stuff together, and they develop ideas, and they make plans, and they organize, and they make change. If that hadn't happened, women still wouldn't have the right to vote. African Americans wouldn't have the right to vote. A lot of what we take for granted now, even things that we might think are not maybe as important, like you go into a restaurant in Connecticut, you don't have to deal with cigarette smoke. That's because people organized and made the changes, and that was done collectively. And yet, at the same time, these changes are through individual transformation too. Something happens. Something happens when Rosa Parks says, I'm not going to go to the back of the bus. Something happens when people decide individually as well that I want to live a life in a different sort of a direction than the conformity of the process. And I think that's an ongoing paradox, that we need to work and change and evolve and create artistically, politically, socially together, but it's an internal change as well at the same time. And I think of people who have stepped out, who have stepped forward, who have been willing to be transformational, and it doesn't mean that we ever heard of their names. There are thousands and many, many thousands just in this state who have made their communities better, who have made changes, we are standing on their shoulders. We didn't even know their names. We didn't know who they were, but they decided to work together in a different way. I do want to mention, though, somebody whose name was well known in this country for decades. And I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this, but one of the ways I learned in high school was sometimes I would skip school. I mean, you're not supposed to say that, right? I'm sure nobody here had ever skipped school. But I was growing up in suburban Maryland, and when I was a senior there, a junior senior, I'd get a little restless. Once in a while, I would read in the paper there was going to be a hearing on the U.S. Congress, and so I would go down to Capitol Hill. I was like 16, 17 years old. And one day, I went to a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was chaired by Senator William Fulbright of Arkansas. And this was February of 1968. And there was a representative of the Lyndon Johnson White House there who was speaking about White House policy. And I saw, as the hearing was going on, there was a guy who was starting to speak on the Foreign Relations Committee. He was the senior senator from Oregon, used to be a Republican, became an independent, became a Democrat. He was a Democrat at that point. And Senator Morse said, and recently I went back and looked at the official transcript to see the words that I had heard back when I was 16 years old, sitting in the back of that hearing room. I can still remember the afternoon light filtering through the Venetian blinds when Senator Wayne Morse said to the representative of the President of the United States, "You go back and tell the President that I do not intend to put the blood of this war on my hands." Can you imagine a United States Senator in an open hearing saying that to the representative of the President of the United States of his own political party, while close to 500,000 U.S. soldiers were stationed in Vietnam, where they were dying when they were killing and being killed, when the enormous pressure on so many people in all walks of life, including the United States Senate, was get along to go along. Don't put yourself in a vulnerable position where somebody's going to say you are unpatriotic. Don't put yourself in a vulnerable position where somebody will say you don't support the troops. And yet, Senator Morse, like Martin Luther King Jr., came to the conclusion that there was something more precious than conformity and popularity. As Dr. King said in one of his last speeches, vanity asks us, ambition asks us, is it popular? But conscience asks us, is it right? And that question is a very difficult one to answer quite often in our lives, and yet it's imperative we do that to our own satisfaction. Charles Darwin said that, in his opinion, what distinguishes human beings from other animals more than any other characteristic is conscience. And conscience is not nearly as easy as it seems, particularly in retrospect, because, again, in real time, there are all these messages and pressures coming on us. And sometimes, as the great Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg has pointed out, what we identify as conscience may be telling us something that is actually not valid. Somebody can say, my conscience told me to do X. And what does that mean? So when somebody says, my conscience told me to do something, that's a starting point, but it's not an ending point. It's part of, I think, our challenge to be involved in an ongoing inquiry with ourselves and each other in real time and ongoing time. And, I sometimes think of history as like, an ongoing movie, right? And everybody who walks into that movie theater with the movie going walks in with the movie already in progress. It's like, imagine you go to Waterbury, walk into a movie theater, the movie's already been playing for a while, you walk in, you try to understand what's going on. But you need to try to learn what happened before you walked into the theater. A lot of times history is like that because we become aware, we read the Boston Globe or the New York Times or whatever, and we're trying to grasp what the story is, what the storyline. But the study of history gives us an opportunity to understand the context of where we are. Theater, and I know you do a lot of theater here, Les Mis and a lot of other productions, and one of the precepts of theater is that you see change, that change happens through the course of the play, the production, or whatever. And it's like we see a moment in time, like an arrow in the air, and you open your eyes, and for a split second, that arrow just seems to be stationary in the air. But it's always moving. Our lives are always moving. As a Buddhist thinker has said, not always so. We will never be in this spot again. Even if some of you who aren't seniors will be back in this morning meeting in a matter of weeks. But this moment in time, again, is the real time. And you all, everybody in this room, we have a role in history, whatever that will be, to act, to choose to take action, to not choose to take action is a choice as well. So I'd like to close by sharing with you my memory of one day in the late spring of 1968. I was almost about ready to celebrate my 17th birthday, and my dad took me downtown to an area, the ellipse and the grassy area, and you can walk easily from there to the White House and to the base of the Washington Monument or even to the Capitol. And there was a tent city at that point. And it was called Resurrection City. It was the endpoint of the Poor People's Campaign, which Martin Luther King Jr. was engaged in helping to organize when he was killed in Memphis. And I walked among those tents. There had been a lot of bad rain there. And I walked through the tented area, and little did I know that this Rainbow Coalition, as we would later call it, this Poor People's Campaign, was at a cusp of history where literally and figuratively the federal government, which was spending huge amounts of money for war in Southeast Asia, would come in and bulldoze Resurrection City. Here in 2013, we have an opportunity anew to resurrect our faith and our hopes. Not faith in any narrow sectarian sense, and hope not in a cliched sense. I sometimes think these days that one of our two major political parties has given faith a bad name, and the other has given hope a bad name. And yet the reality is, I believe we need faith and we need hope. We need faith in democracy, and we need the essential hope that together we can create a much better world for the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.